The prophecy we ignored, Eisenhower's warning and the machine that ate America. Act 1. The general who saw the future. On January 17, 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered his farewell address to the nation. He was 70 years old, completing 8 years in office, ending a public service career that spanned 5 decades. Eisenhower wasn't a politician by nature. He was a career military officer who'd commanded Allied forces in Europe during World War II, planned D-Day, and accepted Nazi Germany's surrender. He understood military power intimately, its necessity, its costs, and its dangers. In his final speech as president, Eisenhower issued a warning so specific that it's worth quoting directly. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. This wasn't vague anxiety about militarism. Eisenhower was identifying something new, a permanent fusion between the Pentagon, defense contractors, and Congress that created incentives to perpetuate military spending regardless of actual security needs. Here's what made the warning remarkable. Eisenhower wasn't a peacenik or an outsider. He was the ultimate military insider. He'd built the massive defense establishment that won World War II. He'd presided over its expansion during the Cold War. And he was saying it had become dangerous. The initial reaction was muted. Some commentators praised his wisdom. Others dismissed it as the musings of an old soldier out of touch with modern strategic realities. Most people simply didn't understand what he was warning about. The military-industrial complex in 1961 was still new enough to seem like a temporary arrangement, something that would shrink back to normal once the Cold War emergency passed. It didn't shrink. It metastasized. Act 2. The overlooked detail. Here's what Eisenhower understood that most Americans didn't. World War II had fundamentally changed the relationship between government and defense manufacturing. Before World War II, the United States had a small peacetime military that expanded rapidly during wars using civilian manufacturing converted to military production. Car factories built tanks. Textile mills made uniforms. When wars ended, factories converted back. World War II was too technologically complex for that model. Radar, aircraft, nuclear weapons, advanced communications. These required specialized facilities, proprietary knowledge, and continuous research and development. So the US created a permanent defense industrial base, companies that existed primarily or exclusively to sell weapons to the government. This seemed rational during the Cold War. The threat was continuous, so readiness had to be continuous. But it created a new economic reality: corporations whose profits depended entirely on military spending, and regions whose employment depended on defense contracts. This created constituencies with powerful incentives to maintain high military budgets regardless of threat levels. By 1961, Eisenhower could see the pattern forming. The defense budget wasn't being determined by strategic assessment of actual threats. It was being determined by institutional inertia and political calculation. The incentives pointed one direction: always more spending. Act 3. The peace dividend that never came. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. By 1991, the Soviet Union had dissolved. The Cold War, the existential threat that had justified decades of massive military spending, was over. Economic analysts predicted a peace dividend. Defense budgets would shrink. Resources would shift to domestic priorities. The temporary Cold War emergency posture would finally end. The defense industry had other plans. Between 1990 and 2000, major defense contractors consolidated through mergers and acquisitions. Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta. Boeing absorbed McDonnell Douglas. Northrop acquired Grumman. The industry went from dozens of major contractors to 5 dominant corporations. This consolidation had strategic logic. With reduced military budgets, companies needed to achieve economies of scale to survive. But it also concentrated lobbying power and made the industry too big to fail. When representatives tried to close military bases in their districts, defense contractors organized workers to protest job losses. When procurement budgets faced cuts, industry-funded think tanks produced studies warning about Chinese or Russian threats. The revolving door accelerated. Defense executives became Pentagon officials. Pentagon officials became defense executives. The line between regulator and regulated blurred until it barely existed. By the late 1990s, the promised peace dividend had been captured. Act 4. The forever war as business model. The war on terror was the military-industrial complex's salvation. Unlike the Cold War, the war on terror meant active, ongoing military operations across the globe, creating continuous demand for everything. The spending was staggering. Between 2001 and 2023, the United States spent over $8 trillion on post-9/11 wars. A substantial portion of that went to defense contractors. The wars didn't end when their stated objectives were achieved. The Taliban was driven from power in 2001, Bin Laden was killed in 2011, and ISIS's caliphate was destroyed by 2019. Yet US military involvement continued for years. Why? Because the institutional infrastructure built to fight these wars had become self-perpetuating. Military bases, defense contracts, and think tanks all adapted to permanent war as a normal state of affairs. Eisenhower's warning had proven prophetic. The complex didn't need victory. It needed continuation.